This is the Next Bite of Life podcast, the place to be to hear personal stories from expats, digital nomads, and everybody else taking their next bite of life. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Next Bite of Life podcast. My name is Kem Kem. My guest today is Christine Osazuwa. Say hello to everyone, Christine.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today, Kem Kem.
Oh, I'm so glad you were able to make it. Now I know you're in London, and I'm dying to ask you all about London. But first, we'll start from where it all began, back in the US. There. So the time machine is going backwards. So tell us your story.
Yes, well, the year is 1990. I was
Cool.
born in California, and that's where I stayed for about 3 years, so I don't remember much of that. And then my parents moved over to Maryland when I was about three. I am first generation American. My last name is Nigerian, like myself. And my parents grew up in Nigeria and came over basically in their 20s. And so I grew up in Maryland I grew up in like Southern Maryland for a few years, and then moved to Baltimore by the time I was, I think, maybe 5 or 6 or so. And I
Yeah.
was actually there almost my entire life up until I was 20. Oh gosh, 2027. um,
See, and you're so young, and
oh
you're like
no.
going back, and I'm thinking to myself, look at this kid. She can't even remember now.
No, yes. Until I was 27, so I was there until 2017, and that's when I moved to Sweden. And I stayed in Sweden for 2 years before moving to London about a year and a half ago. Yeah.
Wow. So when you were okay, you were in Baltimore, you went to school in Baltimore, and you were going like, this is it. Were you looking to travel, or did it just happen? I mean, did you seek out jobs overseas? Did you always wanted to travel?
Yeah, so like I always knew I wanted to travel, but I do not think I thought it would be to the extent that I ended up traveling. I had always spent a lot of time in the States. So I've been to
Mhm.
probably 26 states, last time I calculated, or something like that. So I spent a
Wow.
lot of time in the US and like traveling in the US. And I kind of was, that was. That seemed to be what I thought I was going to be doing for the most part.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of states still left to see. I got engaged in Hawaii, for example. So like, obviously, the
Oh,
U.S. is pretty.
nice.
There's a lot of variation just in the U.S. So like I always knew I wanted to travel the U.S. I spent some time working with rock bands growing up, and I like went on tour with one of them to sell their merchandise. Went on tour. It was a blast. We
Oh.
went to like most of the East Coast, for example, and so like that was really exciting. So I went all the way up to Maine, went all the way down to Florida on two separate tours, for example. And so like that's kind of what the world I thought I was going to be in, where I was like, oh, I'm going to see all the states, maybe do a couple of overseas trips once in a while, but I don't think I saw myself living outside the U.S. for so long. Um, I'm really glad I did it, and I'm really enjoying it. But like when I initially grew up, I was like, oh yeah, take a couple of overseas trips. Maybe I'll see Paris, I'll see London,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it
Of
didn't
course,
occur to
and then
me.
come back. Yeah.
Yep.
Now, now, coming from Nigerian parents, I'm sure they were just okay with you leaving, right? Because they themselves came over from Africa, and so they're just waiting for you to travel. Or did you find it was like my mom were like, I think I sent you over there way too early. You're supposed to, So did you get any resistance from them at all?
I always joke. I think they were much more willing to let me go because I got married right before we moved to London, so I
Okay.
had my trusty husband at my side.
Ah,
Um,
gotcha. Which makes a big difference.
So I think they were much more comfortable with the situation. Also, I was moving to Sweden, and my cousin lived in Sweden already. So
Okay.
my cousin's Nigerian. I'm Nigerian, but he grew up there. So
Uh-huh.
he was in Nigeria up until graduate school for him. So he moved to Sweden for graduate school and stayed there. So by the time I got to Sweden, he had been there for 7 years, married a student,
Ah,
produced
so they
two
were okay with
children.
that.
Yes.
Now, when you say you travel with a rock band, I mean, was it like a rock band, or was it Christian rock? What kind of rock music
Oh
was it?
yeah, it was nothing like like I wasn't out with like like a heavy metal band. They play like music kind of like Fall Out Boy, that kind of sound, basically like
Yeah.
poppy stuff that will be on the radio, stuff like that.
Okay.
It was like a band like that. They were friends of mine from DC area, basically. And it was summertime. I was in like uni at this point. And so I had the summer off anyway, and so it was a fun adventure. It was like 2 weeks, 2 different summers in a row, basically. Nothing super crazy. I called my mom back every day. I was probably 19, 20, something like that. A fun way to see this, a fun way to see the states, basically, and so that's what I did. And I'm sure my parents were very confused by the entire situation, but they let me go. So
No, I can see that because obviously, like as a Nigerian, at least in my household, if you weren't, the usual doctor, lawyer, they don't understand anything else. It's like, what do you mean you're making music? What do you mean you're going out to do music? So it was just, I was curious to see if like all the parents were exactly the same. But your parents, at your age, your parents must even be younger anyway. So they might have already adapted to the whole, like, well, my daughter's going to be a strange American kind of thing.
we came around to it. It wasn't an easy process.
Oh, I'm so I am glad to hear that because it just goes to show you that it's something that's intrinsically
Yeah.
in Nigerians as a whole.
Yes, I don't want you to think my parents were like free, carefree, loving hippie. No, that was not the
Okay, good.
case. There was a
Oh,
lot of clashing in
oh,
the
thank
house.
God.
Um,
Okay, good. You are truly Nigerian then.
very much so, yes. Um,
So, so when you moved to Stockholm, did you already have a job? Did you find a job there, or how did that come about?
yeah, so like I mentioned, I have a husband. So basically, what happened is the day after the U.S. election in 2016,
Hmm.
I texted my boss probably at 1 in the morning, and I said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not coming in tomorrow. You can call it whatever day you find appropriate. If it's a sick day, a
Yeah,
vacation
yeah.
day, whatever. I'm not coming in."
A
And
mourning day,
so
a day of mourning.
all right, I was like, I truly did not care what. Like, I'm like, you want to call it a sick day? You want to call it whatever? Call it whatever. I'm just not going to be in the office tomorrow.
Yeah,
And so my husband also took off work that day, and we both got our we literally sat in the living room, got our laptops. We're like, all right, cool. So what countries speak English? So let's
yes.
start there. So we're looking at like Wikipedia, and we're like literally like sorting like the countries that speak the most English column, figuring out okay per capita, who speaks the most English. I mean, so we kind of narrowed down the like the countries we were considering. And so this was November 2016. Mind you, I had a wedding coming up in April, so like
Mhm.
there's a lot going on in my life.
Yeah,
And so we were looking through, and obviously the obvious ones like Canada, and like the UK and like New Zealand obviously came up. People countries that are predominantly English speaking. But we
yeah.
also realized that the Nordics had a really high per capita rate of English speakers in the world. I mean, in the country. So
Mhm.
we were like, okay, that seems like a viable option as well. And actually, at that time, New Zealand was doing this really interesting scheme where they were trying to get more people to immigrate there, especially more
Yeah,
working class people. So we're also, I mean, sorry, blue white collar
yeah,
workers. We were looking there as well because that seemed like an interesting prospect. So we were kind of going through the whole thing, trying to find something. I mean, we started applying for roles at this point. And so that took some effort. We were applying all over the world essentially. So obviously, as Americans, we cannot live anywhere we want.
yeah.
As most people, besides the EU, does not have this luxury of having options for additional countries to live in. Usually,
Exactly.
and so we had to work on getting a visa.
Mhm.
And so, as we were going through the process, we were talking to contacts we had all over the world. We were, like I said, talked to my cousin, obviously. London is a place that I knew that I really wanted to live. But
Yeah.
if you recall, in 2016, also is the year Brexit happened, or the vote for Brexit
Yes.
happened. So I was like, I don't have enough time to read up on geopolitical affairs in the
Yeah,
UK because I'm also planning a wedding.
yeah.
So I might have to circle back to that one. Um,
Exactly. Priorities.
just was like, I don't have the strength to deal with whatever that is. And I
Uh-huh.
knew also thinking about where our options were. I wanted to go to a place that just was like just politically like just not I just didn't I was so stressed out after the election. I was so stressed out from the wedding, from the election,
Yeah,
everything that I was like I just don't have it in me to like feel like I'm constantly like at like at a high alert basically. And so I knew
Yeah.
I wanted to go somewhere where like that wasn't the case. So everyone always asked me like, "Oh, so how'd you end up in Sweden? Or why'd you choose Sweden?" And I was like, "Yeah, I wanted to go to some place that felt like the opposite of Donald Trump. Like if a place could be the
Exactly.
opposite of Donald Trump, that was the place." And so Sweden felt like just like a good hard reset where there was nothing to be anxious about essentially. So going back to your initial question, I know that was a long way to get to
No, no, I love
the
it. I
answer.
love it. I
um,
wanted to hear it.
so my husband got a job offer first from Sweden. He got an offer from a video game startup, which is basically the dream for him. So that was quite great. They were
Okay.
able to sponsor our visa, so they gave him a visa. Obviously, I got a visa too.
Of course.
The merits of marriage and all.
Uh-huh.
And so that was great. Unfortunately, they were such a small startup; they couldn't afford to relocate us, so we actually had to pay for our own relocation. But they
Okay.
did work out our sponsor and sponsor our visa for us.
Okay.
Actually, what was lovely is the day before our wedding, his the person that then became his boss called us to tell us that the visa and everything had gone through and we
Oh,
were all
nice.
approved. So it was our wedding gift to us.
Yeah, I'm
It was
like, what a
wonderful,
great gift.
right? Just a little bit of stress off your shoulders, right? So that was quite nice.
Exactly.
And so that all got sorted out and all got worked out and everything like that. And so then I arrived in Sweden. I did not have a job at that point. It was actually I had been applying. Obviously, once I got the visa in Sweden, I thought it'd be easier because like, oh, I have a visa now. I just applying for
Yeah.
roles super challenging. I actually didn't get a job until about 6 months into living in
Oh,
Stockholm.
wow. Wow.
Thankfully, I had worked as a freelancer for years, so I still had plenty of contacts and plenty of old clients and current clients to call upon. So in terms of money, we weren't really struggling for money. That was
Mhm.
fine. It was more of like a having a reason to leave my house every day. So here we are
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
situation. I guess should have gotten used to it. But yeah, so that was like the process. It took quite some time, but I did end up getting a job in Sweden at a record label, which is why I wanted to be doing anyway, working in music. So it worked out quite well, but it definitely took some effort because I was explicitly looking for music roles while I was in Sweden. So I will say, like, if I was looking for any role, it probably would have been a little bit easier, but it's definitely still very much a challenge.
Uh-huh. Now, how do you find the cost of living in Sweden? I know that you were financially okay, but did you feel like everything was high compared to Baltimore, for instance, you know?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore is one of the cheapest cities to live in.
Oh
Not
yeah? I
like
didn't
in
know
terms of
that.
cities in the states. Like if you
Uh-huh.
look not in comparison to the entire country. But if
Yeah.
you look at just like if I list out the other countries on the east coast of the U.S., for example, you'll hear that like
Uh-huh.
we have Philadelphia, New York, Boston, D.C.,
Mhm.
for example.
Yeah.
Baltimore is like little cusp in there that's much cheaper than all of those other cities. And
Oh,
so
okay.
growing up in Baltimore, I was kind of used to things being fairly affordable. Like
Yes.
rent, like I had my own little studio apartment that I think cost me like I don't know $600 a month or something like that.
Wow.
It was like
Uh-huh.
it was not a particularly expensive place to be. You can go out for like buy one get one drinks. You can go out for happy hours. Like things were just kind of like generally affordable. I like it. Like if you had a job in Baltimore, for the most part, you were able to sustain yourself pretty well,
Sustain. Yeah.
which was really nice. And one thing that I always say is I've been quite privileged growing up, and I definitely recognize that. But one thing that's a challenge is to just because I am comfortable, it doesn't. I don't feel comfortable being around people that I know are uncomfortable. And I don't say
Yeah.
that I don't want to be around them. Is that I don't want that to be the situation where I'm doing fine, everyone else around me is not. Especially everyone
Uh-huh.
around me that looks like me is not.
Yes. Yeah.
It's definitely very some like that's a very much an area of concern to me. Baltimore was always a really like Baltimore had a homeless problem, but not to homeless problem to the extent that you've seen in like cities like San Francisco, for example.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so Baltimore was a much more comfortable place to be because if you could scrounge together, a few $100s, especially
You
if you were
could.
out like outside the city a bit,
Yeah.
you could live comfortably. I knew like my parents were renting out like the a
Mhm.
2 bedroom full house, and I think the rent was only like I don't know maybe $800 or $1,000 a month or something like that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that housed a family of four.
Of
Um,
course.
so thinking about things like that, Baltimore was a very comfortable place to be. In comparison, Sweden is a very expensive place if you are not a Swedish person,
Yes.
and that was something
I
that I
found that out.
truly was not expecting. And I explain this to people a lot. What I mean is that they're a socialist democratic country. So they're not fully socialist.
Mhm.
They have elections, et cetera, et cetera. So they're like a mix, a hybrid of both, essentially.
Yeah.
So there's certain social programs in place that make it very comfortable for Swedish people, which is a good
Yes.
thing. Obviously,
Yeah.
I'm very much for socialized government. So,
Yeah.
for example, there is a government list for housing. You
Mhm.
have the choice to put your child on it as soon as they're born, or I think the only other option is they can put themselves on it when they're 18, basically.
Okay.
What this list does, essentially, and I my Swedish is not great, so I could be missing some of the nuance, but to the extent I've talked to my Swedish friends, I understand what this list does is when it takes about 20-ish years or so from when you get put on the
Mhm.
list to when you're available, when the housing is available to you. So obviously, if you
Yeah.
get put on at birth, that means once you're done uni, essentially, you'll have a
Exactly.
place.
Uh-huh.
And The longer you wait, the more I guess the equivalent of money available to you for a home.
Oh, I see.
So if you do it like if you do it 20 years out, basically, and I'm sure the time is expanding or getting longer for the time
Mhm.
being, but let's say if you do 20 years out, you could probably get like a studio apartment, maybe like not quite in Center City, and you only
Yeah.
have to pay the equivalent of like 400 euros a month for it.
Oh, I
Um, if
see.
you're willing to spend more money, you can get something bigger, et cetera, et cetera. But they're very much like there's a very low threshold, and
Subsidized, yeah.
it's a subsidized rental property.
Nice.
So what
I never
happens
knew
is,
that.
right, it's a really good process. But what happens is, if you did not get put on this list, or you are an immigrant coming in, obviously you're not on this list.
Of
And
course.
so people, though they have subsidized rental property from the government, they can still make the choice to buy a place. So
Yeah.
own a property essentially. And so if you get put on the list and you also own a place, what that means is you can rent the place out that you own while paying only $400 a month for your studio apartment in the center of the city.
Wow.
And so the people that are not on this list, that need to rent from a private
Of course.
individual, are
Yeah.
paying much more for their rent than the people that grew up
Ah.
in the city, basically, or grew up grew up as a Swede on the list. And so we were in a situation where we were paying the equivalent of almost like 2,000 euros almost, a month for a two-bedroom
Wow.
place, not
Wow.
not on the main island, but like an island over essentially. And so like it wasn't so cost prohibitive, but knowing that people are paying like 500 euros for
I it really I can just imagine every day I would see them like I would have to like say silent word like
like
I can't.
So yeah, seeing that and understanding that is definitely a frustrating situation. So obviously, if you come over, thankfully, my husband and myself were both working, fairly comfortable jobs, making above. In order to get your visa approved from the Swedish
Yeah,
government, you have to make a certain amount above the national
yeah.
average, for example. So we were both
Uh-huh.
making good money by the time
Yeah.
I had like my full time role and everything like that. But could you imagine coming over as an immigrant without
No,
that?
I could
Um,
not. You would
like
have
as
to live
mhm,
like 20 in a room or something.
yeah, exactly. We're
Wow.
coming over as a refugee, obviously. So if you recall, during this time, this was also a time where there was the Syrian refugee crisis was also happening during this
Yes.
time. So there was a lot going on. The
Yes.
world, like, I know the world seems insane right now, but if you recall back then, the world was also very much insane.
Exactly.
And yeah, so like there was a lot of different combating forces. Like that's something that made it really challenging, was like that type of cost, for example, in terms of housing.
Yeah.
And then the other area that I think was good, I would say. So a lot of Swedes, people that are born in Sweden, have summer houses. So like a second home. Usually they're not like lavish
Nice.
homes.
Uh-huh.
They're usually like places that are like have sometimes like most people have summer homes that have no running water or electricity. So like they're not exceedingly expensive homes, but most people, like a lot of Swedish families, have them and have passed them down through their family for generations. When
Yeah.
we first arrived in Sweden, I was very confused. I was like, how does everyone have enough money to buy
To
this
have a
second
second
home?
exact.
Because salaries in Sweden are not particularly high either.
Yeah.
They're not even that
Yeah.
high in comparison to their other Nordic counterparts. So
Uh-huh.
I found that very odd. I was like, how's this possible? And then I realized, and this is also most of Europe as well, so I won't give just Sweden this, but Sweden has mastered it, is that in Sweden, there's no such thing as an emergency.
No?
What I mean by that is university is free. Um,
Uh-huh.
Healthcare, I'm here in London, we have the NHS, but healthcare in
Mhm.
Sweden is some of the best healthcare I've ever experienced in public. Before I
Mhm.
had a job, it still cost me about 20 euros to go see a doctor. My prescription cost about 4 euros, for example.
Mhm.
Like it was very comfortable.
Yes.
When you have a child in Sweden, not only do you get 480 days to share between you and your partner off work
Wow.
with up to 80% of your salary, depending on there's a cap, but up to 80% of basically the average Swedish salary you'll keep receiving for all 480 days. In addition to
Amazing.
that, when you do go back to work, healthcare, I'm sorry, daycare is not free. However, the Swedish government gives you about 80 euros a month for every child that you have. And I believe, if I recall correctly from my cousin, their daycare cost was about 100 euros a month. So it's essentially
So
subsidized to
it
some
costs you
extent.
not exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
Transportation system, especially in Stockholm, but actually in most of Sweden, is unreal. It's clean, on time,
Yes.
and
Yes.
far reaching and far expanding. Even their
Yeah.
train system is far expanding as opposed to like some cities where like the train's really good in center city, and then as you get
Hmm.
out, you just have to go to a bus. Their
Yeah.
train system, like you could take a train from Stockholm all the way to the north of Sweden in the Arctic Circle, for example, and it costs you about 30 euros ish if you book
Yeah.
it far enough in advance. And so there's a whole infrastructure where if any emergency, like there's no emergency because if the
Hmm.
emergency happens, the government has already taken care of it
Taking
for
care
you.
of it.
Um,
Wow, that's amazing.
yeah,
Now, why didn't you just put yourself on the list and, and then just wait it out? If it's so great, why did you get to London? I mean,
yeah.
it
So
sounds like a
I will say we are on the list though. We did put our list up on the list when we got there. We're like just in
there you
case.
go.
We are
Uh-huh.
on the list. But so the thing about Sweden is that there are a few things that are as an American are really tough, I think. So first of all, I was a lot of Americans I encountered in Sweden were married to Swedes. Same with the British people I might have encountered, Australians, et cetera, et cetera. All the people
Yes.
like from English-speaking countries tend to be
Yeah.
married or involved with Swedes. Being
Okay.
there without a Swedish partner was really tough because obviously, even though I believe more than 90% of the population of Sweden is completely fluent in English,
Yeah.
all of the government documents are all in Swedish.
I'm
Um,
Swedish.
I am one
Gotcha.
of those people that actually reads my terms and conditions and reads my contracts thoroughly and wants to understand exactly the nuances and things like that. That was
Yeah.
a struggle, just continuously. I'm like, what's the tax law? What's the implications? I don't really know what's going on a lot. Mind you, of course, that is the pitfall of someone that moves to a country they do not speak the language of. The
Hmm.
Swedish government, on the side note, does provide free Swedish classes for 18 months for anyone that comes to Sweden.
Hmm.
If you are a refugee coming to Sweden, it's full time classes. If you are a working professional, refugees, it's full time and required. If you're a working professional, it is part time and not required. But we did take Swedish classes for a year
Oh,
while we were
wow.
there. So we did work to learn the language. But
Great.
not knowing the language was challenging when it came to things that were pertinent to your life.
Yeah.
But it's fine to not know language when you go out to eat dinner, basically.
Yeah.
In addition to that, speaking of dinner, I did not love the food. The
No.
variety of food is tough. There's a lot of Swedish food, and I discovered I don't particularly like Swedish food very much.
No.
And that was really challenging because food something that was really important to my husband and I. We spent a lot, like we plan our vacations around food.
Around food, exactly.
Like the food's very important. So not like not
Yeah.
not loving the food was like it wasn't the only reason why we left, but like that wasn't something that like I didn't feel like I was being nourished to the extent that I wanted to be from my food being there. And then on top of that, like making friends was really actually really quite tough because Stockholm is not a city that's particularly transient, like the DCs
Yes.
or the New
Uh-huh.
Yorks or the Londons or the Singapores of the world, for example.
Oh, yeah,
There's not a
yeah,
huge expat community. I
yeah.
remember most of those expats are married to Swedes, so they get to assimilate into their Swedish partners' community that
Exactly.
they've developed.
Family. Uh-huh.
And so that was also quite challenging because no one's looking at very few people are looking at making new friends when they're 30 years
It's
old,
true. Yeah, it's
like
very true.
when their best
Yeah.
friend's still down the street, their best friend they
Yeah.
went to uni with is still there. The population of Sweden is only 10 million people. And so given that people aren't really willing to make new friends, so it's really challenging to like build those like strong friendships and like, build those strong relationships.
Yeah.
And I always joke there was a trip that I took. I took a trip to Australia and it was actually for work. Work was nice enough to pay for a trip out to Sydney for some work meetings.
Uh-huh.
And when I went out there, it was summertime, so I will give them that. It was January in Sweden, so obviously the middle of the winter. Australia
Uh-huh.
was summertime, so I'm in Australia, and I went to meet up with a coworker that was in Australia, and actually I met up with a few different ones, and so one the Friday of work, last Friday while I was in our office, it was summer Friday, so we had a half day, and we went out to the pub, and then we went to the
Mhm.
beach, and then I texted someone that I had met earlier, and we went out for dinner, and then we went out
Yeah.
dancing. Next day, my coworker and his girlfriend at the time invited me over to their place. We made some food. We played board games. We went out for common night, a different night. We went out to dinner a different night, and this was all in a span of like a week in Australia. And this was with a
Wow.
coworker that I had met twice prior to. And I said,
Yeah.
thinking about that, I'm like, I had never been to any of my coworkers' houses in Sweden at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
People that I spent every single day with. Not
Yeah.
that I would be best friends with all of my coworkers, but that was more of just like a sign of just like it's really tough to make make friends,
Yes.
develop friendships, given that I was able to build a stronger connection and a stronger friendship with someone that I had met twice that was all the way in Australia compared to people I
Exactly.
spent all of my time with that I spent
Yeah.
8, 9, 10 hours a day with. And so that was I was once I left Australia and came back to Stockholm. First of all, when we landed, it was snowing, and I felt like I was being personally attacked by the snow at that time. Just to spite me.
It's yeah, exactly.
And coming back from summer in Australia, obviously. But like I was like, I don't need to be in Stockholm anymore. Like having that experience where I was like, I can like. It's not me. It's the
Mhm.
city, which is something that I had to accept. Where I'm like, I'm not making friends easily, and
Yeah.
that's not my fault. It was
Yeah.
not for a lack of trying, a lack of effort. Because given the situation that I saw in Australia, where I was like, oh no, I'm capable of making friends. I'm capable of making friends from different countries. This is
Yeah.
my doing. And so once I figured that out, I knew that it was time for me to go somewhere with some, going somewhere where I can find plantains very easily and I can make
Yes.
friends. So that's how I ended up in London instead.
So so how long was it, from the time you started thinking about it when you came back from Australia to actually making it happen? Was it something that happened right away, or did you have to like now start making plans like to transfer your job or to find another job? Like how did that go?
Yeah, so of course, at that point, like I mentioned at the start of this, as an American, I can't just pick up and live wherever I want. If I was in
Exactly.
Sweden and I decide, hey, I want to live in the UK, I can just pick up and move to the UK the next day, and we're all good. Unfortunately, not quite the case. As Americans,
Mhm.
of course, we had to figure out our visa situation again. So I
Mhm.
was talking to a lot of people internally within the company I was working for, seeing about opportunities. Unfortunately, it turned out. All the opportunities that kind of fit what I wanted to be doing were based out of the US, and I wasn't quite ready to go back home yet. So that ended
Yeah.
up not being a good viable option for me.
Yeah.
So my at the same time, my husband was applying for jobs as well, and so him and myself both got our job offers from new companies pretty early, pretty quickly, which was lovely. So
Oh,
when I got
great.
back from Australia, it was like February, or like late January or so, and I
Uh-huh.
believe by May, so February, March, April, 3 months ish. We
Mhm.
both had new job offers with a relocation package, and we were able to move to London 2 months after that, basically.
Oh, fantastic. Now, you think that's it for you? You think London is it? Or would you move anywhere else?
Yeah, it's funny because like that was another thing that I found really interesting. Like I mentioned, when I started, it took me 6 months to find a job to get to Stockholm, and it was 6 months once I was on my feet were on the ground in Stockholm. So not including
Yeah.
all the time I spent prior to. And
Yeah.
like getting a job in London, I applied for a job on the internet. I got the job, I got offered it, and everything without stepping foot in London. I did just come in for I think one interview, but I didn't have to be
Mhm.
in London to get that job. So it just felt like I'm in a city that just kind of appreciates me more,
Yeah. Yeah.
appreciates my talent. I don't like to. Well, I'm not the most humble person in the world, so I don't mind bragging. But I have 3 degrees and a good amount of
Mhm.
experience. So
Yeah.
it taking me 6 months to find a job that I'm more than qualified for was frustrating at the minimum in Stockholm. So coming to London, like those are all the little signs I knew like London was a much better place for me. Is like it shouldn't have taken me so long to find the job that I wanted.
Yeah.
It wasn't a particularly down market like that. Like if it was a time like this with COVID, it'd be different. But it was definitely an employees market. So London is a
That
place that I traveled for work to London a few times prior to moving here, which is funny because I had never been to Stockholm before arriving to Stockholm. So I already knew that I really loved London. I knew I loved
yeah.
the people, the food, the environment. I would say the weather is not amazing, but in comparison to Stockholm, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I knew London felt like a more permanent home for me immediately. And I think immediately in Stockholm, I knew it wasn't a permanent home.
Yeah.
That was something that was like I think that like a lot of people can just kind of feel it if something
Yes.
feels right, and like London very much
Exactly.
feels right to me. Stockholm felt like a good temporary place, and I was
Yeah.
absolutely necessary. I wouldn't have changed the order in which I did things. Stockholm was
Yes.
definitely the reset I needed, something that was calm and comfortable that I could just kind of be with myself with, as opposed to
Yeah.
London, where London, I always say London is very much like European New York City. It's
Yes.
loud, a lot
It's got everybody from everywhere.
exactly. So there's a whole different energy that I needed, like having come off my wedding, which was a really stressful time, and the election, and everything like that. I needed that much more calming energy of Stockholm for those 2 years before coming over to London. But London is definitely somewhere that we're going to stay for some time,
Yeah.
especially thinking about. It's funny because obviously for everyone, COVID has put a lot of things into perspective. And for me,
Yes.
thinking about COVID and the situation and where we're in London, mind you, we're in the center of the city in London, so like I always joke,
Oh,
if the zombie apocalypse breaks out tomorrow, we're not faring well.
yeah.
However, given that, we keep thinking now that we can work from home, we can work anywhere. We're like, where do we want to work from home? And considering the answer would be different if it wasn't for the fact that we're in a pandemic. I'm like, there's nowhere I'd rather be than London.
Yes.
I really love London, and the way London as a city just kind of affords you a lot of options. Like
Oh, yes.
you can walk along the Thames. You can go. Took a road trip up to Scotland and just like went hiking and things like that. Well, obviously that's not London, but that's the UK as a whole. And then even like the options for like cuisine and outdoor dining and things like
Uh-huh.
delivery and all of these things that are available to me if I can't travel, if I can't go home and see my mom. Having like options for things to do, ways to see friends that are safe and things like that, I don't think I
Yeah.
would be able to get them to the same extent
Anywhere.
in any other city right now than I could in London. So I know that I love London and I want to stay here for some time. But I
Yeah.
think it's my I'm not sure after living in Stockholm and now living in London, I'm not sure if I can deem anywhere forever home right quite yet. I haven't actually been to Asia yet, for example. I
Uh-huh.
mean, get to Australia and skip over like an entire continent. So
Yeah.
I would love to travel to Australia, travel to Asia, and then maybe consider living out there for a couple of years, kind of just a whole
Yeah.
different situation, maybe like Japan or Hong Kong or Singapore
Uh-huh.
or something like that. I think would be really interesting. I work in
Yes.
the music industry, so one thing that's nice
So you
about
can
the music
go.
industry, we have a lot of offices. The
Uh-huh.
company I work for now, Warner Music Group, has 50 offices around the world ish, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Uh-huh.
previous company I worked for had like 70. So it gives a
Okay.
lot more options for
Yeah.
people to work, people to
Transfer it.
talk to, get to know, etc., which has been quite nice and has even in Sweden, I think between work trips and personal trips, in the 2 years I was there, I think I went to like somewhere along the line of like 14 countries or something like that.
That's
Um,
great.
which was amazing. And then
Yeah.
obviously here being in the UK, we have nonstop flights to anywhere in the entire world. So
Yep.
a lot of
And you
options.
have cheap flights sometimes, like the Ryanair 5 pound, flights. And I mean, you're living the dream because London is like my favorite city. Well, it's tied with Istanbul as my favorite city in
Mm,
the world.
mhm.
And my husband was like, he's like, I would polish shoes just to be able to live there. I go, we cannot afford it. We just can't. But we go as often as we can. I think like in the last 5 years, it's probably been like 20 trips. We just love it, but we can't stay there. So we'll get our feel and then leave. And he's like, but I would want to be like in Knightsbridge or Chelsea, just those two places. I'm like, well, for sure you're not going to be able to afford it. So just go visit and come back. So
That's
it's
a very
great that
funny
you're able
option.
to do that and experience it. And you've been able to find friends too, right?
Oh yeah, I think that I find it funny because I found friends so quickly in London. It was immediate, like, and friends from all over the world, and some Brits and work friends. Like, it was immediate that I had friends. I was going out to brunches with new people right away. We
Yeah.
were planning like trips together right away. It's just a whole different situation in Stockholm. We have like two friends that are like our best friends from over there, and we didn't actually go on a trip with them until after we had left Stockholm, for example. After though we met those people, we met them. They're our best friends now, but we met them a month into living in Stockholm. Um,
Uh-huh.
we didn't actually travel with them until after we had already moved to London, for example.
Yeah.
Because here in London, the friends I made, we were already planning like trips together. Unfortunately,
Uh-huh.
some of those trips got curtailed by COVID, but it was definitely much easier to build like stronger friendships, stronger connections, things like that.
Yeah.
so rapidly here, and also just the diversity. I
Oh
would say
yeah.
amazing because London is about, I believe the stats would say London's about 40% black.
Yeah.
Actually, the city I came from, Baltimore, was about 70% or something around those lines. But I have
Mhm.
more black friends here in London than I
Yeah.
did in Baltimore, even only because one thing that's different about London versus London being a big city versus like the big cities in the states is that um, diversity spans across economic and social classes as well
Yes.
here, much
Hmm.
more than it tends to in
Yes.
the States. So in
True.
the States, the correlation between being black and
Hmm.
being lower class and lower income is
Hmm.
much more likely than it is in Europe. Mind you, it's
Yes.
still not amazing. Let's be real, very few places are, but it is a much better situation. So I just found myself, there's more people around me that are in my
Yes.
similar state in life
Uh-huh.
here in the UK, here in London, as a black working professional woman
Yeah.
than there were in Baltimore, even though there were actually more black people in Baltimore.
Mm.
I'm not saying that I need to limit my social and like my friends to just people that are very similar to me, but just in
Yeah.
terms of making it easier to make friends and see friends on a regular basis and being available on the weekends and things like that. It just makes it so
Yeah.
much easier.
Yeah.
And so I've been able to develop friendships from all over the world, from people that live here from all over the world. From I have a couple of Hispanic friends. Like I have a Latin friend. Like I have
Hmm.
a few Black British friends, a few Black
It's
people from all over
the
the world.
cosmopolitan.
It's some very colorful dinner tables that we tend to have, which is really really wonderful.
That's great. Now, we can't ignore the cost of living in London, though, right?
Oh yes, I
It's
mean
not so cheap, is it?
is very much not cheap. I am paying more than the 2,000 euros a month I was paying in Stockholm for our two-bedroom flat here. Mind you, I'm in Center City here.
Yeah.
I'm just south of Shoreditch here in London. So
Oh,
we're
nice.
very centrally located, so that
Yeah.
the supplement of rent is definitely made up for the fact that I can walk to the tube station right around the corner. So it's not particularly cheap. I'm probably paying close to, I'm converting real quick, probably like close to £3,000, 3,000 euros a month
Uh-huh.
for
For the
rent.
apartment.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for our two-bedroom flat. And I think when I convert everything to euros for Sweden does not use the euro, nor does the UK. But
Mhm.
I always say the euro is probably like the level of currency that people understand the most in the world, besides the US dollar. So it's usually my
Yeah.
default.
Yeah.
So that's what that's what we're paying right now for our rent. However, the one thing that's different in comparison to Sweden is that in London, the cost of doing everything else is cheaper. So in Sweden, everything that was a requirement for you to live was very cheap. So
Huh.
that's like groceries, for example, like your
Really?
gas. So groceries, your internet bill, like your cell phone bill, things like that were
Those
very
are
cheap.
requirements for living?
Yeah, I mean, in the most of the Scandinavian countries, I believe, and like also the Baltics, I think Estonia, for example, I think Finland, if I recall, are both countries in which they have deemed that internet access is a human right. For example.
Ah,
So
okay. I didn't
they're
know
much
that.
more progressive in that stance, in that
Yeah.
process. So a lot of the bills, like your household bills and things like that, are fairly cheap in terms of their cost. I believe to some extent some of it is subsidized by the government, of course,
Mhm.
but all of that is fairly cheap. And like I mentioned, the daycare, university,
Mhm.
etc., are also
Yeah, yeah.
fairly cheap. However, in Sweden, eating out, going to dinner, going to lunches, like things like that. All of that was very expensive.
Oh,
Um,
we found that out.
much
We
more
found
expensive.
that out.
Um,
I said I'm never visiting Stockholm again. It's way too expensive to eat out,
so,
and
so,
no, no, no.
Yeah, and if you want to be really, really surprised, head over to Norway or Denmark, where the same krona, they're
Uh-huh.
different kronas, are even the conversion to like the euro, the US is much higher as well. So like you're accidentally spending so much money.
Yeah.
Um, so in Sweden, yeah, so like we love to eat out, and if we did find a good place we wanted to eat, we were spending so much more money. In London, like
Uh-huh.
we could eat out here and we can go sit down at like a fancy like Michelin star restaurant and do the whole thing. Of course, that's going to be quite expensive because we're in London.
Yeah.
But if we wanted to go down the street, like there's like Spitalfields Market or Borough Market, things like that, where it's fresh cooked food, like great food, and it will cost you like £7.
Yeah.
It's a whole different vibe. Like that middle ground of like
Yeah.
in the US we'd call it fast casual, for example, which would be like the
Uh-huh.
equivalent of like the Panera Breads, the Chipotle's of the world, where they're made to order. Um,
Mhm.
that doesn't exist in Stockholm. There are very few places like that. So you either had
Yeah.
like sit down restaurant or like McDonald's
Or
or the
yeah,
equivalent.
yeah.
There's the Swedish equivalent to their fast food, and there was no good middle ground. And the middle
Mhm.
ground, as like a working professional, is like the space that we always lived in the U.S. And a space that we constantly living in here in London as well, where we can just get good quality delivery or good quality takeout of things like that. So like, and then
Mhm.
also just like events and like the movies and things like that are actually not quite as expensive when you do the conversions in London as they are in
In London.
Stockholm, because all of those things are like non-essential in Stockholm, so they tend to just be much more, much cost a lot more than they do here in the UK. So like in terms of like money spending, we're not spending
Yeah.
so much more money, even though our rent costs more.
Yeah.
Because of the habits that we have of traveling and eating out, those cost less here. Oh, and the one thing that's also like quite cheap in Stockholm, I forgot to mention it, is the transit passes are much cheaper in Stockholm than they are in London as
In
well.
London. Uh-huh. That
For
I
two reasons. But that's another thing that I mean when I say like the things that are essential to living tend to be
yeah.
much cheaper in Sweden.
If you had to guesstimate how much you spend on a monthly basis, for instance, in London, how many pounds per month do you spend in, rent and food and going out and all that? Just a rough estimate for somebody listening out there for two
Yeah,
people.
I mean, it's a little odd now because the way we spend money is not quite the way we normally would, given the
Yeah,
pandemic.
COVID.
So we're spending
Yeah,
a lot more on groceries than we normally would and things like that.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, our rent's about 3,000. I think we're spending about. I'm just going to say it all in euros, basically about 3,000 euros ish, and that's for a two-bedroom flat in Zone One in East London, basically.
Mm-hmm.
We probably spent about, let's see, I'm trying to think about like our cable and like internet and stuff like that. Probably maybe 100 euros ish, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
My husband
Mm-hmm.
is the one that pays that bill specifically, so I do not know. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
think it is. Our cell phone bill is about 25 euros a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just for the actual service, not the phone. We already had phones when we arrived, so we're not paying
Uh-huh.
for that. Groceries on before COVID, we're probably spending maybe 250 ish, maybe 200
Mm-hmm.
on groceries.
Mm-hmm.
And then eating out, we're probably spending something more in the ballpark of 300 or 400.
Mm-hmm.
Now that combo of money is probably still around the same, but like it fluctuates depending on how locked down we seem to be.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we're
it's
in the
true.
ballpark of 500, maybe like 500-ish euros a month on some way of consuming food, be it groceries
Mm-hmm.
or eating
Mm-hmm.
out or whatever. And then like entertainment, we're usually probably spending like maybe 200-ish euros. Um,
So,
on entertainment, and that's like going to the movies, going to London is known for like immersive experiences and like
mm-hmm.
just going to the theater and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we spend
Yes.
something on that every month. Yeah,
So it adds up to about 4,800, about 5,000 euros
yeah,
uh,
probably along that
a
line.
month. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good for a city like London.
And
So
we're saving a good amount. I am a stickler for saving, so we are saving usually somewhere in the ballpark of about 20% of our salaries. Plus, I'm putting between the two of us, I think on average, we're putting about 15% of our salaries and our pensions as well, our UK pension.
great.
So I think
Exactly.
that's a lot of money that we're blowing through, but we're also saving a good amount of money.
Yeah. No, and it's great because on that amount of money, I'll put your website down on the show notes on nextbiteoflife.com, but they can see that, you guys, I see pictures of you in, Amsterdam and all this. So you're enjoying your time, but you're still saving and, you're living the life that you want. And one of the things I wanted to point out from what you said was like, you left home and you went to Stockholm, but you knew it wasn't for you, because one of the things I try to tell people all the time is just because you left to go someplace doesn't mean that that's where you're destined to be or what have you. If you don't like it, you can always move. And most people are so scared and they think that when they move somewhere, they have no choice and they have to stay there because, this is what they told people. They're going to have their family disappointed or what have you, but you just gotta keep moving till you find your rhythm, and you found yours in London for now, and it serves you well. So I
Yeah.
really like the fact that. No, go ahead, sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. I talk about that all the time. They're like, "Oh, you're so brave to move to Stockholm." I'm like, "Not really." I'm like, "The U.S. didn't take my citizenship away when I arrived in Stockholm. I could go back at any point in time. Like nothing is stopping me from
Exactly.
going back. If I wanted to pick up the, I guess my lease would probably be a bit of an issue. But if I wanted to pick up and go back home right now, nothing would. There's no one or anything that would stop me from doing so. But it's
Exactly.
not. And like it'll be easy for me to get a job in my home country more than it is to get a job here. So that's not even a problem
Yeah.
from the way
Yeah.
my life has worked out. And the other thing that I think is also that I tell people a lot is that big cities or even moderate sized cities have more in common with other moderate sized cities than they do.
Yes.
Like, so I said I was moving to Stockholm, and I'm like, yeah, but my life in Baltimore, or let's say your life in New York, moving to Stockholm or moving to London, they're very similar. You're gonna go out to eat, you're gonna go
Exactly.
to the theater, you're gonna
Yeah,
eat food,
exactly. You're gonna do your laundry. It's gonna be it's gonna be life only somewhere else,
right,
And
exactly.
if you
Think of
don't
all the
like
things
it,
you're used
move.
to. And so I tell people all the time, like, think of all the things you're used to. So like, it'd be much more jarring for me. Like, it's more in common for me. Like, things in my life was more in common with Stockholm than if I had moved to, I don't know, like rural Iowa or something like that.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
those things are much more. That would be a much more challenging situation, a much larger culture shock for me to move to
Exactly.
the language I speak.
No, I think it's great for people. That's one of the reasons I like the podcast because I like to showcase people living life unconventionally and living in by their own terms and doing what is right for them and not letting fear like be the overriding factor in everything. Like you said, somebody said you're brave. It's like, no, you're doing something and it's very hard. Of course, you tell people you have to conquer your fear, and it's like it's almost impossible to, but you've got to override it and just go for it. Now, I'm going to, I know I promised you, let's see. Okay. I'm going to leave you one last question before we wrap up.
Okay, no
Now,
problem.
tell me, how did you meet Michelle Obama? How did that come about? I know you
Yeah.
won't let anybody forget it, but how did it happen?
Yeah, I wish it was a much cooler story than it is, but it still was amazing in of itself. When Michelle was doing her, she released her book, Becoming, and she did a book tour, and so she went all over the world doing this book tour, and then there were options in there to have when they were selling tickets on sale, there was options for the meet and greets, and the meet and
Ah,
greets were very expensive, obviously, but I one thing that I said was actually fate was the day that the meet and greet tickets went on sale. It was our around Christmas time that year, and it was our end of the year party for work. And so that year, I won an award, a Rookie of the Year award. And so with that came about 500 euros as an additional bonus for work. And I think the Michelle tickets for the meet and greet were maybe around 800.
yeah,
So I mean, not cheap or anything, but I was
yeah,
like, hey, I just got 500 euros I was not expecting. That's amazing. And
exactly.
obviously the sign that like I should spend that money on something that I want to spend that money on.
Yeah.
So I bought the tickets to meet her online, obviously, and got there, and it was amazing. And actually, I found out afterwards that it was actually one of the cheaper meet and greets on the tour.
Oh,
I
wow.
met multiple people that had come from other countries because it was cheaper to book a flight and a
Oh, my
hotel and come to
goodness.
Stockholm than it was to do the meet and greet in London, for example. I think the London was at about £1,000, which when you convert that to the euro, it's probably more like
Whoa.
1,200, 1,300, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So obviously, I met some really good, cool people while I was there. But yeah, I met her, and I think at this point, I don't think we had fully. We were like, I think we had just decided maybe we're moving to London. We weren't really sure. We were still working things out, and I was talking to her, and I tell people the story all the time, so I will tell you what the conversation looked like. So you write down your name on a piece of paper, and you give it to like her handler, the person
Uh-huh.
that's her assistant, right? She hands that paper to Michelle. Michelle's like, hi, hi, Christine, it's really great to meet you. And I was like, oh, it's really great to meet you too. And I was like, as you can tell, I'm from the States. And she goes, yeah, I figured that out. I'm from Chicago, and I was like, yeah, I know.
It's like, boy, do I know, right?
And she was like, say she's from Chicago. And I was like, yeah, I know. And she's like, and I was like, she's like, how long have you been here in Stockholm? I was like, I've been here for 2 years, but I'm moving to London soon. And she goes, look at us black girls traveling the world. And I was like,
Yeah,
absolutely. She high fived me, gave me a hug, and that was the most part, the bulk of the interaction. But it was just a wonderful like reassurance that I'm doing something right. Um,
yeah,
wonderful to meet her. And then obviously she had the meet and greet happen before her talk, so then she had her whole the whole talk and the Q&A session and things like that afterwards. But it was wonderful. And we got the pictures, obviously, as you can see on
Yes.
my personal website, and I sent it to my father.
Yes, I saw it.
My father was my parents were very pleased, obviously, and one day I went home to meet my parents. I went back to the States and I picked my dad up because I borrowed the family car, obviously, because I don't have a car in the States anymore. And
Mm.
when a woman looks in the car and looks at me and she goes, "Oh, you're Mr. Osazuwa's daughter." I was like, yeah. And she goes, "Yeah, he showed me your picture with Michelle Obama." I was like, "Of course he did."
You know, everybody that he knows has that picture or seen that picture.
It's time he didn't print it, to be honest. So
That's great. That's fantastic. What a great. Now, before I let you go, tell us about your website again so that anybody who wants to check out your adventures can see it. And as I said, I will have it on the show notes, but please just tell us what the website is again.
yeah, of course. So it's ChristinaOsazuwa.com. That's just my first and last name.com. And it's just kind of a collection of all of my internet life essentially. So I have all of my travel blogs are on there, and I keep very meticulous travel blogs about all of my travels, so you can follow along. We do a lot of activities in like 4 or 5 days. So if you want to follow along with my fun formula of travel, it's usually a mix of like at least one fancy dinner, a nice brunch, something outdoor, something that takes me out of my comfort zone. For instance, in Budapest, we went like caving, which I never
Hmm.
done before, which involved like crawling and like sliding your body through boulders.
Oh
Unreal.
my
Um,
God.
so did that. So we usually have something that's kind of like something that'll take me out of my comfort zone a bit, and then usually try to do something that has like a late night vibe. So if we end up going to like a fun party or a club or
Mhm.
something like that, or like even like an evening out in the theater, that's usually like my travel formula, and like I like to fit those into like a 4 or 5 day trip or so. But you
Yeah.
can see all of those on my travel, all of my travel adventures there on my website. Also have if anyone happens to be interested in music or the music industry or technology, those are the fields I work in. So there's a lot of pieces on there about that as well. I'm also very passionate about diversity and inclusion, especially in the workplace. So I
Mhm.
have a lot of content on my website about that as well. So yeah, definitely check it out.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Christine. It's been fun. And it's like I learned some things about Stockholm that I didn't know. So it kind of makes sense the way I think now, like what I think of the city. But it's still expensive and I'm still not going
Yeah, definitely.
there.
I would say my favorite Nordic city is actually Copenhagen. So
I loved Copenhagen, but I'm not going back there either.
also
It's too
quite expensive.
expensive.
But I found it way more fun than Stockholm. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much for having me, Kevin. Kevin. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later and we'll see you on the chart somewhere where you're, the marketing people that the marketing thing that you're doing with all these groups. And thank you again. And everybody, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the show if you like what you're hearing. And we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.